All right. This is a really interesting section that we're about to get to here in the book of Galatians. By way of a little bit of review and running up to the section that we're about to deal with, I wanted to point out in the verses, I think we got up to 16. Yeah. Or no, not 16, 10. I wanted to point out in the chapter up to this point so far, just what a sort of balancing act Paul is doing rhetorically. Okay, Paul is an interesting writer. Right? Sometimes, he's not always giving you everything on the surface. Sometimes he's tongue-in-cheek. Sometimes he's acting really humble up front, but he's actually including all kinds of details in there that make you know that he actually, he does have a case and he knows what he's talking about, even though he's totally downplaying. And this is a topos you don't just see in Paul. You see this throughout literature. The man who actually does have a case to make and who has a lot of qualifications, but who's sort of downplaying that up front so that you don't hate him. Downplaying that up front so that you will think of him as a gentle and humble guy, but the way he does it, you know that he's actually got the stuff. You know it's under the hood just by the way he does it. There's an intro that Martin Luther wrote for somebody else's book, and something that I translated, and this was a really good example of that. It was really funny. Luther starts out saying, I'm not a great stylist, and these people that are always writing against me, surely they're better than I am at communicating. They're more eloquent, they're more learned, all this. But the paragraph in which he's saying this is such a complicated, it's like stylistically, it's just crazy. He's like every other sentence is a quotation from the Bible or from classical literature, and he's making all kinds of really fancy allusions and metaphors and using very, very elevated diction. We kind of get that in this chapter in Galatians too. And Paul, he's got this balancing act between. This is a Cadillac argument for opposing the false teachers in Galatia, right? Because they're saying that they're coming with apostolic authority. They're coming from Peter and James. They're coming from Jerusalem, and Paul's this Johnny-come-lately who doesn't really understand what the real apostles are saying on this point. We do understand better. We just came straight from them. We're hot from the oven, so to speak. So this, that Paul has an actual account that he can give of taking a Gentile to Jerusalem and laying out his gospel before the leaders of the church and having them say, yeah, that's right. And no, we're not going to circumcise Titus. And then, he takes it even step further in the next section we're about to read, where he rebukes Peter for something Peter has done based on this understanding about the gospel that he shares with Peter. That I share it with Peter so much that I can actually rebuke him when he strays from our shared understanding. This is bullseye, right? This is like right between the eyes of the Judaizers, this argument, because he's undermining their whole claim to authority, which they move against him by being able to appeal to the same people from which they claim to derive their authority. But the point that he's more interested in making, and that he started out making in chapter 1, is that the gospel is God's word. It is the power of God. It is the gospel of Jesus Christ himself, that God came into the world as a man to give to us. And so it doesn't depend on any man. It doesn't depend on anybody's testimony. Even if I myself came back and told you something different, or if an angel from heaven came down and told you something different, that messenger should be accursed, because the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. The gospel stands by itself simply on the testimony of God. And so he's trying to make these points at the same time. One, that I don't need their testimony, that I am an apostle, and this came straight from God, and this is a word that is greater than the word of any man. And two, I don't need it, but I did get it. So he starts out with this. He goes up, he says, verse 2, in order to make sure that I was not running or had not run in vain. right? So he gives you a little bit of a reason there to think that maybe he was wanting to hear their opinion. Like, it's been 18 years. I really would like to talk it over with the other apostles and make sure that we're totally on the same page here, and there's no misunderstanding, even a small misunderstanding on my part. But he also has just gone to pains to tell us that it took 18 years for him to do this. So he is very confident. He's very confident that he is right and that he has not been running in vain and that he does have the gospel correct. But he does want to talk to them all the same. And then, let's see, verse 6. From those who seem to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. So in the middle of appealing to the fact that the apostles gave him this, that the apostles signed off on his gospel, in the middle of that, he says, not that as people they're anything special. The gospel stands on its own. But they said they saw I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter with the gospel to the circumcised. And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, okay, James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, these guys who seem to be pillars, who, take it or leave it, but they're the three biggest names in the church, okay? It's like, so what do you have in your art collection? Well, got a Van Gogh and a Matisse, if you're into that kind of thing. Whatever. He lists these big names, bending over backwards to make this big show of how it's not all that big a deal that these guys are agreeing with him. Of course these guys are agreeing with me. It's the gospel. And they're apostles. By agreeing with me, they are not actually vindicating my gospel. They are vindicating their own apostleship, because this is the gospel. And if they opposed it, then they would not be apostles. They would not be pillars of the church. This is the power of God. This is the word of God that defines and how you know who are the apostles and who are the pillars of the church. It's the ones who teach this doctrine. It's the ones who defend this doctrine. So he accomplishes both things here. On a human level, against the Judaizers, he takes away their appeal to authority by saying, I've got the same appeal to authority, and I've got it directly from the horse's mouth. So if they've told you that James or Peter have said something different about my gospel, they're lying to you. But he also does it in such a way that at every turn he's subordinating even their testimony, and as he said in the first chapter, even his own testimony. He's subordinating any person, any individual, no matter how central to the organization of the church, to the Word of God.
When Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he was clearly in the wrong. Before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter in front of all of them, "You are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs?"
Okay, this is really where the rubber meets the road here. You have a church that is composed of Jews and Gentiles, and in some cases it's pretty homogeneous. Like the church in Jerusalem at this time seems to have been really homogeneous. It's pretty much a straight Jewish church, and if there are people ethnically Gentiles among them, most of those used to be proselytes. You might remember in the Pentecost reading, when it talks about the crowd that had come together for the Passover that Peter was about to preach to, it says both Jews and proselytes. That was two of the groupings that were listed in that long list of pairs of the different places people had come from, what their origins were. So the proselytes were Gentiles technically, but they were Gentiles who had adopted the Jewish religion. Now, they hadn't actually, like every proselyte had not accepted circumcision necessarily, but some of them had in fact gone that far. And they were Gentiles who were living according to the law even before the preaching of Christ. And so it seems likely that there were Gentiles in the Jewish church, but that, I mean, in the church at Jerusalem, but that most of them were proselytes and had been even before becoming Christians. So the Jews continued to follow the Jewish customs, circumcision and all that. Why wouldn't they? You know, it's the law of God. Jesus was fulfilling the law of God, not destroying the law of God. He had said that himself. So the Jews themselves continue to follow their customs. And the Gentiles among them who, you know, may already have been proselytes, may already have been doing it, they just accept Christ too. And you basically have a church that's Jewish and Christian at the same time in Jerusalem. But when you get out from Jerusalem and you have a church that's largely Gentile, or like the one in Galatia, which the churches in Galatia, which were apparently, or no, this wasn't Galatia, this was Antioch. Yeah, verse 11. Antioch, that had a large Jewish population as well as lots of Gentiles. Then you have to actually figure out what we're going to do that will work for everybody. Turn to, keep a finger in Galatians, but turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. St. Paul writing, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel." Yes?
I've always wondered about that. Becoming everything for everybody. What does that really mean? See, I feel like the Methodist Church, and Jim and I've talked, leans sort of that way. They're trying to please everybody. Every color, race, you know, and everything, and they've just lost all of their credibility or whatever. What does he actually mean here, that he's going to be everything to everybody? How can he be?
I think you'll get an answer throughout from this conversation that we're starting right now, because it's that passage in 1 Corinthians 9 makes it seem like he's wide open, but Galatians he's completely closed-minded, right? Galatians, he's just a bull charging straight ahead. There's this one thing, even if an angel tells you different, don't listen to him. So in trying to understand in Galatians chapter 2, we're looking at this broader context, and you'll see how they relate, I think. Ask again if we get to the end and you still don't have your answer. Acts chapter 16 is another place to look for the background of the conversation surrounding chapter 2. At the beginning of Acts chapter 16, Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. And then the one other passage to look at is Acts 21. This is Paul actually interacting with James, who was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. Verse 17 in Acts 21, "When we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. After greeting them, he related one by one the things God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified God. And they said to him, 'You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. They are all zealous for the law. And they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality, which is a reference to the decision of the council in Acts chapter 15 that Paul was also at. Then Paul took the men, and the next day he purified himself along with them and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled, and the offering presented for each one of them. Okay, so background here is that Paul, and really anybody who's a leader of the church and evangelist in this time period, is kind of caught between 2 worlds, right? The Gentiles are coming into the church, and it has been the decision of the church, Acts chapter 15, based not only on the experiences and the ministry of Paul, but also on the experience of St. Peter, when he had the vision of all the unclean animals coming down from heaven in a sheet, and a voice tells him, "Arise, kill, and eat." And Peter says, I haven't ever eaten anything that was unclean. And the voice says, don't call unclean what God has made clean. And then he wakes up from his vision, and there's Gentiles at the door wanting him to come to minister to the centurion Cornelius. And he goes and preaches to Cornelius, and while he is preaching and they are believing, they are visibly receiving the gift of the Holy Spirit, and he says, wow, they've gotten ahead of us. I guess we should baptize them. And normally that happens after we baptize people, but in this case, they've received the gift of the Holy Spirit. Let's baptize them. Let's get this. Even though God anticipated our application of the water here, that turns out to be a necessary revelation from God, because then Peter has to defend his actions back at Jerusalem. Why did you baptize those Gentiles? And he says, well, they'd already received the Holy Spirit. So I figured that God had already, that was our sign that they should be baptized, because normally that happens when you're baptized, right? And so based on these experiences, it was specifically Peter and Paul, and then James was the one who spoke up and made the decision in Acts 15. The decision was that the Gentiles didn't have to be circumcised. They didn't have to live according to the law in order to be members of the church. But the bulk of the church, the whole Jewish root of the church, which means pretty much the whole church at Jerusalem and in Judea, was still living according to the law, was still being totally observant of the law of Moses. And so when Paul says that among the Jews he acts as a Jew, and among the Gentiles he acts as a Gentile, so that he might be all things to all people, what he's saying is he doesn't want to have any ancillary, any peripheral issue that causes offense that gets in the way of the gospel. If he's ministering to Jews, Jesus Christ is the point, and the circumcision and all the things he's going to say later in the book of Galatians about the law being passed. It's all true that stuff is not necessary for salvation. All of that fulfilling of the law is not necessary for salvation. But Paul says, yeah, I understand that, and the apostles understand that too, but these are still the customs of our people. Right? We do these things because they are the customs of our people, and they are not harmful in themselves as long as you don't say that you're saved by them. So I don't make an issue of it. When I talk to the Jews, I follow the Jewish customs. James will give me 4 guys to sponsor in their vow at the temple. I'll do it. If I have somebody that I want to take with me and make an associate in my ministry, and he's half Jewish, like Timothy was, he's got a Jewish mother. But the Jews of the area are not going to listen to him because they're like, oh, you're a half-caste. Your dad wasn't a Jew, so we know you're not actually circumcised. Well, he had Timothy circumcised so that Timothy would have a productive ministry among the Jews that he was going to minister to. But when he was among the Gentiles, he didn't talk about it much because it wasn't their custom. They had no reason to do it. They had no reason to submit to circumcision and to all of these laws of Moses that were ceremonial unless it was still in force and part of what was necessary for being a Christian and part of what saved them. And so among them, he wouldn't do those things and he wouldn't talk about it because that was optional. That was cultural. It was cultural. It was purely cultural now because Christ had come and had fulfilled it. And Peter's doing the same thing, right? But Peter's used to living in a completely Jewish milieu. So he's used to just doing all the ceremonial law. And now Peter comes to Antioch, and suddenly he's among a bunch of Gentiles. And so he's like, well, right, I know this principle. That's the optional stuff. That's the cultural stuff. All these people are my brothers in Christ. Even though they're Gentiles, I will eat with them, even though, part of the ritual purity of the ceremonial law is not to eat with Gentiles and to, keep kosher and all that kind of thing. I will go ahead and eat with them. And when in Antioch, do as the Antiochians do. But then suddenly, these people come from Jerusalem, this contingent of Jews from out of that Jewish milieu where everybody is still obeying the law along with everything else. They come from James, he says, because James was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. Certain men came from James. And now suddenly, the two worlds are colliding, right? If you're trying to be everything to the Jews and everything to the Gentiles, but you've got Jews and Gentiles together in the same place, and you find that there's a conflict, which one wins out? And it seems to be that Peter hasn't actually run into this conflict before. He hasn't run into this collision of two worlds, and he hasn't thought it through yet. He doesn't know how to act, and so he just sort of reverts to what he's used to, which is eating with the Jews and following all the ceremonial laws. But now when he's doing it in Antioch, this means he is suddenly excluding. He is suddenly disfellowshipping Christians, fellow brothers and sisters in Christ with whom he previously did share communion. And remember, when we're talking about eating, we're not just talking about social niceties, whether you get the same table at Cracker Barrel. We're talking about also the Lord's Supper, right? Because the Lord's Supper is a meal, right? It's a communal meal. And I have to think that Jesus, one of the things, God's a great chess player will do one move for 5 different reasons, and I think God does one move for 5 different reasons also. One of the reasons why Jesus gave us the Lord's Supper, I think, was to anticipate this melding of the church between Jew and Gentile. Because Jews and Gentiles, if they were going to be one church, if they were going to worship together, they would have to take the Lord's Supper together. They would have to receive the Lord's Supper together, and that would make them one. That would break down this ceremonial barrier that said you can't eat together. Right? If the Lord's Supper, instead of a meal, was some other kind of a sacrament, some other kind of a sacramental thing that you did in church that did not involve sharing a meal, they could have done that in church, Gentiles and Jews, and then gone to their separate dining rooms afterwards and continued to exclude each other in, ceremonial in all other areas of their life. But they couldn't do that and still be one church because the sacrament of unity, the sacrament of the body and blood of Christ, the sacrament of making you the church as the body of Christ was a meal. And the way the early church did it, it really was a meal. It's a pretty symbolic meal the way we do it because it's one piece of bread and one sip of wine. But in the early church, they would have a whole, potluck where the actual bread and wine would be part of it. But the love feast would be, it would happen in the context of a larger meal. And so Peter kind of he gets caught out in the middle here. And he reverts, he just goes with what he's used to, and what he's used to ends up causing offense to the Gentile believers, because he's not just following a custom and eating with his own like he would be back in Jerusalem. Now he has given the cold shoulder to all these Gentile Christians, and he has disfellowshipped them, essentially. So what Paul says, when Paul calls them on the carpet, is, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? And Peter probably hadn't thought it through like that, but Paul's saying, you are forcing the Gentile believers to live like Jews because you just gave them the cold shoulder. You just went into this closed room and they weren't allowed in. You just told them that they're like not really part of the church. And if they want in, they've got to follow the ceremonial laws. They've got to make themselves a Jew, and then they can get into that room and be part of the real church with all you cool guys from Jerusalem. Mike.
What's the biblical purpose for the ceremonial laws of Moses?
The book of Galatians is a great book for that, because when Paul gets to the theological arguments for the last 4 chapters, that's going to be a major thing that he's talking about. But the quick answer is that they are to preach Christ in advance. Well, that's one purpose. They preach Christ in advance. They point forward to Christ, especially the sacrificial system. And you can see how that happens, the sacrificial lamb, and Christ is going to be the sacrificial lamb. And the priestly system and the role of the priest, and Christ is going to be the high priest. But also it had a historical purpose, and that was to keep the Jews separate, to keep the Jews as a separate people from the nations around them. And when you read through the Old Testament, you realize that this was a real danger. It was a real danger that they would just get assimilated, that they would just become like one strain out of many strains of just generic Canaanites or generic Egyptians or whatever, because they were constantly being enticed by the religions around them, right? The problem throughout the Old Testament, time and time again, like every time you go through the cycle in the book of Judges, right? They fall away into idolatrous worship. Then God judges them by basically saying, well, if you want to be like the pagans, how about you get ruled by the pagans? You can be part of a pagan nation if you want. Sure, okay. Here come the Canaanites. Here come the Syrians. Here come the Moabites. Here come the Philistines. They'll take you over. They'll be your overlords. You can be one of them. And they cry out for help, and the Lord sends a deliverer and brings them back to the true worship. And then it happens again. And it happens that way throughout the kings, too. You have a good king who promotes the worship of the true God and suppresses the worship of the false gods. And then you have a bad king after him, and he worships the false gods himself. And so the purpose of the law, a lot of the law, a lot of it has a dual purpose. It points toward Christ, and it has this separating function. But historically speaking, the separating function was very important because it made them a separate people when they were constantly trying to be just like everybody else. They were trying to worship the same gods. When they decided they wanted a king, right, they came to Samuel and said, give us a king like all the other nations have. If they had to follow all these ceremonial laws and always think about, what am I eating? Have I touched anything unclean lately? Do I have the right percentage of different kinds of cloth in my garment in order to be ritually clean? I need to circumcise my son. These things, they all had a purpose of making them different, making them weird, giving them their own customs that made them glom together among themselves, rather than just be exactly like everybody else. And especially when they went off into captivity in Babylon, that was crucial, because some of them came back, but they didn't all come back.
Was part of that to stay 100, just marry Jews? Yeah.
Just marry. And we have, of course, cases in the Old Testament where women who were Gentile women were brought into Israel by marrying a Jew. And I guess there are also cases where men were brought in and they would be circumcised. So it wasn't purely an ethnic thing, but it was, you had to be observant. You had to be an observant Jew. You had to live by the law of Moses. And, to marry a pagan who retained her paganism like Ahab did, right? He marries Jezebel and she brings her gods with her. Or like Solomon started doing when he was making pacts with all the kings in the area. That undermined the true religion and undermined the religious cohesion and faithfulness of Israel. So yeah, that was out. But the ceremonial law, that was the historical purpose it serves, trying to keep them as a unique people so that they could testify to the true God, to their Gentile neighbors, and also so that they would be still a people when the Messiah came. They would be a people who cared about the Bible, who cared about the prophecies, who knew the prophecies, and were able to see when Jesus fulfilled them. And they were able to say, oh, this guy's the Messiah. When Jesus was teaching his disciples how all the scriptures point to him, if he hadn't had disciples who cared about the scriptures, he's like, oh yeah, those are the scriptures. Those are the words of God. Those come from our fathers. Those are ancient. We've had them for 1,000 years. They go back to Abraham. And if they talk about you, then we believe. If they talk about you, then you are from God. If they didn't have that background, what did he have to work with? These scriptures testify to me. What are the scriptures?
So what you're saying is that God wanted to keep them separate so that he could use them as a tool or a beacon towards Christ.
Yeah.
But I don't know Jews that much, or I don't understand them that well, but I've always gotten the impression that they're not that big on evangelism, or that they're not trying to convert you into Judaism.
Right. Well, that was, in the Old Testament, it was largely that way too. Like, they didn't really go out evangelizing the heathen because it was a national religion, right? They were the children of Abraham, and it was possible to come from outside and be included in the covenant, but it wasn't something that they went out to try to talk people into doing. But if they could just be a city on a hill themselves, right? If they could be a nation, like in the times of Solomon, when they actually were a powerful nation, and Solomon was a king whose renown went throughout all the area, and the Queen of Sheba came to visit him, and he had all this commerce going with the Gentiles who lived in Tyre and Sidon. If Israel could have maintained that kind of status and at the same time actually maintained the true worship of God, they could have been this real light on a hill, and the Gentiles around them would have been drawn to it. And that was the idea. And even though they were constantly falling into sin, it did happen, right? There were a lot of Gentiles who were drawn to it, who were included in Israel. You think of Uriah the Hittite, that faithful soldier that David wronged. He was a Hittite, right? He was a Gentile, but he was also a faithful citizen of Israel, and seems to have been a worshiper of the true God. So
Pastor Meyer said something funny one time. He said back in the Old Testament, the old part of the Bible, when you had like these different nations, he said they all had their different gods, and when they would fight each other, it was like, my God's tougher than your God. He's going to fight your God, and it's like you had a bully for a friend, and the other guy's got a bully for a friend, and you're going to bring your bully, and he's going to bring his bully, and see which one's tougher on them. Right.
And what you get when you have a really successful empire building is that the winner, the empire, starts to see through this and starts to think, yeah, either our gods are tougher than all their gods, or it's just that we're tougher than all their gods. And so, like, when the Assyrians are coming in on Hezekiah, the Assyrian spokesman outside the walls says, did the gods of this nation save them? Did the gods of this city save them? Did the gods of this other city save them? No. None of those gods were up to stopping the Assyrian army. Well, don't think your gods is either. He doesn't even appeal to Assyrian gods. He's just talking about the might of the army and the might of King Sennacherib. He sounds like an atheist, actually, making this. But he's got half of that description anyway, in that he views it as conquering the enemy gods. Your gods are all weaker than our army is. And I guess a more religious, a more pious Assyrian probably would have put it in terms of our gods are stronger than your gods. But this meant that, when the angel of death brought a plague around later on that night or later on that week, and most of that army that was so big and swaggering died, and this great deliverance was wrought by, a pretty big coincidence. Modern people might be able to convince themselves that was just a big coincidence, but ancient people, they knew that was the hand of God, especially after the Assyrian had trashed the God of Israel that way, saying he can't defend you against us. So that was the kind of thing that by choosing a nation and having this nation worship him alone, or supposed to worship him alone, and remain independent and separate from all the Gentiles around, that when it would give God opportunities to stick up for them and to rescue them in that kind of a way, and this would make the Gentile nations say, there's something different about Israel. There's something different about Israel's God, i.e., he actually saves them. And so the separateness of Israel and the specialness of Israel was actually also for the sake of the Gentiles, so that they could be a beacon, and so that God could work with them in ways that made the other nations take notice.
The thing I was talking to you about, that movie, The Ten Commandments, you've never seen it, you said, right?
Not all the way through.
All right. Well, at the end of it, they do something sort of like that. His wife pushes him to the point that his son dies, and they're sitting there, and all these priests and everything are praying over his son, trying to bring him back to life. And she keeps telling him how weak he is for letting Moses go. And she pushes him to the point where he goes after him with the chariots, and she says, "Bring me back his staff and his robe so that I know you've killed him and killed his God." Something to that effect. And then he comes back and he throws the thing down, and he says he's going to kill her. And she says, "Before you kill me," she says, "show me that you killed Moses, that you were strong enough to do that." And he stops and he throws his sword down and he sits down and he says, "His God is God." And it's real dramatic. It's you.
I think that was true.
Yeah, I know, but it was pretty cool.
Nice. Sounds like a good scene. Yeah, I think other parts of the ceremonial law had other purposes too. I mean, like even the thing about, like getting mildew out of your house and making a religious issue about not having mildew in your house. Or, the rule about how many days you'd be unclean if you touched a dead body, or how many days you'd be unclean if you came in contact with blood some other way, like including menstruation. All of these things that seem so strange and so nitpicky, and definitely did have the function of separating Israel from the Gentiles in the way I've just been describing. They also stressed purity. The idea that if God was going to dwell with you, you have to be pure. You have to be pure in a way that the other nations aren't, because God's actually living with you. And this purity involves all of these things, all of these ritual things. And these ritual things, if you think they actually make you good enough for God, then you're missing the point, because God is still deigning to dwell with you, and you don't deserve it. But as long as he is dwelling with you, you need to realize that he is dwelling with you, and you need to try to be pure in all these ways. And you are a purified people set apart for God. And so like this has a meaning that translates to the church also, even though we don't follow the ceremonial law anymore. We understand that we are supposed to be pure in the same way, and that we have in fact been made pure in the same way by Christ.
I always thought that God did that for the purpose of sanitation. Some of those things, like pork and some of the stuff that they had.
Yeah, some of them seem like they would have health benefits also. Yeah. Certainly, the making pork an unclean animal saved them from some trichinosis. Okay, but getting back to this confrontation now between Peter and Paul. The church father Saint Jerome, late 4th, early 5th century. He had an interesting theory about what's going on in Galatians chapter 2. He didn't he didn't take Paul at his word that Paul was actually rebuking Peter here. Because he's thinking, he looked at all those passages that we looked at, right? 1 Corinthians 9 and Acts 16 and Acts 21, which show examples of Paul being all things to all people, right? Paul being a Jew to the Jews, allowing Timothy to be circumcised, or actually having Timothy circumcised, going along with sponsoring those guys at the temple when James suggested it, and just saying that I'm all things to all people so that by all means I might win some. So Jerome says if Paul was really serious about this rebuke in Galatians chapter 2, then he was being hypocritical. He's accusing Peter of being hypocritical, but he would be being hypocritical actually, because we have this paper trail that shows that Paul himself had done these things that Peter was doing. You know, Peter's just being all things to the Jews, right? He's just meeting with the people who came from James, and he figures once they leave, he'll have a chance to explain things to the Gentiles and smooth it over with them. And so Jerome, in Jerome's understanding, he thought that Peter and Paul had this basically arranged between themselves, that Peter was going to be all things to the Jews since he was the apostle to the Jews, and then Paul was going to call him out because he was the apostle to the Gentiles, and then they would have a mock confrontation in public, and they would talk it out, and everybody would understand. Based on what they said, everybody would understand what was going on. It's a creative interpretation. Jerome ended up in an argument with St. Augustine over this, though, because Augustine said, well, that means the apostles were lying. In Galatians 2, they were shamming, making it appear that they were having this big dispute when really they weren't having it, and that's deceptive in itself. And even if that's, even if you could give them a pass on that, then Paul is certainly wrong when in how he describes it in Galatians 2. You're accusing Paul basically of being a liar so that Peter doesn't have to be a hypocrite. And it doesn't really, you're not improving situation at all. You're just dissing one apostle instead of the other one. And Luther, in his commentary, definitely sides with Augustine on this. And he says that what Jerome doesn't understand is that the situation in Galatians or the situation in Antioch and in the book of Galatians as a whole is different. This is not just, sure, you can go ahead circumcising. You can continue circumcising, you can continue keeping kosher, you can continue doing all these things, because you're still a Jew, You're a Jew, you're a Christian. You don't have to stop all the customs of Moses just because you now follow Christ, who is the fulfillment of Moses. You can continue with the law. But you cannot do anything that will require or imply that you are requiring that the Gentiles have to do the same thing, that this is the only way to Christ. And that's what Peter had done in this case by, it wasn't in a vacuum with no Gentiles within the radius of the bomb that he had decided that he was going to just meet with Jews. There were Gentiles right outside the door saying, what? What's going on? We thought we were in. And so he was implying to them that they had to live like Jews if they really wanted to be in, if they really wanted to be part of Christ. And Paul had to deal with Judaizers often enough that he knew that if he let this go and he let Peter do this, that this would give all kinds of aid and comfort and encouragement to the Judaizers. Even though Peter himself had spoken up in council against the Judaizers and said, no, the Gentiles don't have to be circumcised. No, they don't have to obey the law. If Peter acted like this, and it got around that he acted like this, then by Peter's example, he would destroy what he had actually said. People would say, well, maybe technically they don't have to, but if they really want in, if they really want to be part of the church, and you would have all this, well, maybe you don't have to, but don't you want to obey the law of God? Maybe technically you don't have to, but God did say it. One of these, you're taking away with one hand what the other hand gives. And Paul just saw that this wasn't gonna be possible. You weren't gonna be able to maintain the gospel if the chief of the apostles was going to be doing this kind of thing on the side. He actually had to be confronted, and he had to admit publicly, yeah, okay, you're right. Otherwise, the Judaizers, who were going to be saying what they were going to be saying no matter what, they would have ammunition. Rob.
Kind of just strikes to the fact, too, that it's men, all of the great patriarchs of the Old Testament had some grievous sins as well, and Paul killing Christians, and now is one, and Peter denying Christ, but then also rejecting. Until on this side of glory, men are imperfect vessels for.
Yeah. Even the apostles. And this is a point that Luther makes in his commentary. This is another one, and you can multiply them from the Bible with much worse sins. I mentioned David and Uriah earlier. The Bible, one reason that the Bible shows us prophets and apostles and great heroes of the faith being caught in sins is to encourage us, that the prophets and the apostles and the Old Testament saints they're not a different species than we are. They're not super believers. They're not super saints that we cannot aspire. They actually are like us. They share our flesh and blood, the same as Jesus shares our flesh and blood, and they're not God any more than we are, and so they fall into the same pitfalls that we do, and they are saved by the same means we are. Mike.
I can't remember the name of the book. Might have been Josephus, but it was one of these histories of the church book I read a few years back. And the thing that was so screwy about it compared to the Bible, and I think it actually makes the Bible more convincing, is that they don't try to describe these people as exceptional people. They show you that they're flawed. But they had this description of this one guy, I can't remember what it was. It was about some guy in the 4th or 5th century. And they described him as being special ever since he was a little child, that he would pray devoutly, and he would do all these special things, and he had been blessed by God and picked by God to be.
Yeah.
And it was like he was above everybody else.
Yeah.
It was the total opposite of what you read in the Bible about these people that are flawed. But that's what makes the Bible more convincing, is that they're not building these people up as something special that God picked and did something. He did, but they're still flawed. And this guy was exceptional his whole life. He was.
Yeah. You're describing the traditional saint's life there. It's called hagiography. Holy writing is the etymology of that, but basically it's hagiography is the tradition of writing saints' lives, and that's the tradition, right? You have something wonderful and amazing to say about them even when they're babies, right? That John the Baptist sleeps in his mother's womb. Well, okay, so my saint's got to do something like that too before he's 2, and yeah, if you're used to reading traditional saints' lives, okay, modern times we go to the other extreme. Modern biographies go to the other extreme, and they just try to find all the dirt on people. They are anti-hagiographical. But the Bible just sort of doesn't care about those categories. It just talks. It just tells it straight, and it really is. If you've read a lot of hagiography and then you go to the Bible, there's only one saint in the Bible, right? If this is what a saint is, there's only one, and it's Jesus. Yeah.
But even with Jesus, it doesn't go overboard on that stuff like it does with those guys. Those guys, you would have thought, there's a little halo around them when they're sitting in first grade class with you or something. And there's a light beam down on them or something. Right. Yeah, this guy's better than Jesus. Why can't you be like Johnny over there? Yeah, the thing happens in reverse too. I think I mentioned in a sermon illustration sometime in this last year, one of my favorite historical stories, the Emperor Constantine VI, Byzantine emperor who ended up being a real proponent for the iconoclast heresy, for saying we should have no images at all, smash all the images, all the pictures, all the crosses. He, according to a source writing from the opposite theological camp, when he was baptized as a baby, he fouled the font.
which I think must mean he peed. He peed or pooped in the baptismal font while they were applying the water. So you could tell right away he was bad to the bone. That's the anti-hagiography right there in a different sense than the modern one. It's just you can tell he was a heretic. He was going to be a heretic. That kid's not going to grow up to be anything good. So that's a good place to wrap it up. Although he's continuing with the same idea in verse 15, but at least that scene of the confrontation between Peter and Paul, we're at the end of that. So it's a good place to conclude. Does anybody have another question or comment for the last minute? Or failing that, a 30-second anecdote.
When you talk about those histories of the saints, I took a Byzantine history course one time, and I remember the guy made us read a book about the history of the saints, and there were about 16 of these guys. And I think he was pointing out how ridiculous it was. That was his purpose in the class. But are you talking about the same guys that lived on those pillars and they would not get off the pillars?
Well, that was. I mean, there's a lot more than 16 lives of the saints out there. It was a medieval and Byzantine industry to write lives of the saints. But yeah, some of the monks in the, particularly in Palestine, living out in the desert wasn't good enough. I guess the desert got too crowded. There were too many hermits or something like that. So some of them would sit on pillars that would be 20 or 30 feet up, so that they would be removed from the earth, even if there was another pillar just down the road. They would be removed and cut off from people and alone in that way to be hermits, with the extra ascetic imperative, I guess, of not being able to stretch your legs very much or take a stroll. So the most famous of these guys was Simon Stylites, meaning having to do with the pillar, Simon of the Pillar, and I forget how long. I think it was about 30 years that he sat on one of these pillars. There was another famous stylite who had been up there for a couple decades, and then there was some theological controversy that he got really interested in, and he came down from the pillar and made an appearance in Constantinople and preached in favor of the true, of the Orthodox faith, and then went back to his pillar, and that made an impression. This is important enough for him to come off his pillar.
They took parts of them after they died and make relics out of them and worship those, didn't they?
Yeah, well, not worship them exactly, or at least they weren't supposed to, but they were very superstitious about them. And over time, the lines blurred, yeah.